Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 29 free hit selection. Part of this, of course, is because I am going to be free hitting on Game Week 29, and we are looking at a blank game week, of course, of 4 fixtures. Those 4 fixtures are the ones that we've looked at for a while now. In terms of sort of changes in our estimations of teams, I think the biggest news, of course, is Watkins has a quote-unquote cut. We did hear that Unai Emery said that he could very well still play on the weekend. So we'll have to see what happens there. But I think one thing to think about too with that sort of little question mark is it does potentially give you an opportunity to go against the grain here with the differential if you are a little bit more in the daring side. And I'll sort of discuss, if I'm thinking about that myself and what my plans would be. Another alternative, of course, is you simply just line up a replacement, potentially a midfielder in this situation, and you go for a 3-4-3 draft and then just allow your team to become a 3-5-2 if Watkins is not fit. That's a very suitable option because unfortunately, let's say if you want to punt with Watkins and go for the next forward for Aston Villa, you'd sort of be blocked, right? Because I think there are much more capable forward options right now in the free hit compared to just replacing Watkins with Duran. Before we actually get started with the Game Week 29 team selection, I thought it would be a good idea to sort of just recap my team in Game Week 28. Obviously, it's a free hit week in Game Week 29, so it doesn't really have a huge impact in terms of how it carries forward to Game Week 29, but I think I just wanted to give my rough thoughts on my team for those of you guys who've been following the series so far and just wanted to sort of know how we're doing. So we did get 75 points in the end. Very, very fortunate. Solanke obviously not delivering the full goods, given the amount of chances that he had. Still a decent captaincy, though, in terms of getting 8 points. Did underscore the Haaland triple captaincy, so unfortunate if you did triple captain Solanke, but also a goal for 2 points, probably not the worst thing in the world. Going back to it, though, Fernandes, Son, Palmer, just amazing midfield dividends. We were close to going for a hit for, Zabarni, but look, I have Senesi in my team. I didn't really want to go for a -4. And part of this sort of goes back to, when I wildcarded, I did go for Tony, to be fair, which hasn't really worked out because I have decided to pivot into free at 29 as opposed to continuing with the initial plan of free at 34 before the FA Cup fixtures, before the injury sort of culminated in my team. I did obviously think about going for Barkley. He did really well. At the same time, I did consider going for Bowen. And so when I look back at that, mixed outcomes, right? Mixed outcomes in terms of how well certain players would have done. We definitely would have kept Fernandes in their team. So that was just real positive. And he'll need to carry the team again in Game Week 30. I don't know if he can do that 2 weeks in a row, but I'm really hoping Bruno can deliver the goods when it comes around to Game Week 30. Because when I look at my team now, one of the issues, of course, that's very glaring in the team is Senesi might not come back. He's got a bad fixture, if he doesn't play. Pau, I can depend on him, hopefully. He just needs to get through this patch in terms of injury, and then he's actually got a good fixture versus Wolves. However, I've got double Arsenal defense and Doughty as well, who unfortunately has a pretty tough fixture in Game Week 30, which is Spurs away. Doesn't really get worse than that in the short term for Doughty, so that is his worst fixture so far, and I really can't rely on this defense. So what probably needs to be done here is a transfer in Game Week 30 for a Spurs defender, even though I'm going to be free hitting into a Spurs defender anyways. And I think by going for a Spurs defender on Game Week 30, what that will allow me to do is obviously go towards Salah in Game Week 31 instead, where he has that Sheffield United fixture. So the way I see myself going to someone like Salah is if I go for, let's say, Udogi from maybe, I don't know, either a Saliba or a Senesi, depending on who's, available, who's not available, I can actually go for, let's say, Salah through Fernandes on Game Week 31, and then also downgrade Watkins to Isaac on 31 as well. So that can be a hit, but a very, very strong hit in my opinion, just to sort of make sure that I have my team sort of tailored towards hopefully what would be the announced double game week fixtures for Newcastle, but then also getting the sort of captaincies in the short term with Salah on Game Week 31. Because with Game Week 30, I think I can just about get away with not having Salah in my team. Son will be the captaincy choice there. Haaland will still be at home at the bare minimum. So I think that's still a very, very resolute team for that week. So not too worried about that. Keeper obviously not in the best shape, but actually the attacking front line for those fixtures are still looking fine. It's just the defense, of course, that calls into question, the strength of my team in Game Week 30. So those are where my thoughts lie right now. And that's it. So that's where my team is sitting. If you guys are new, of course, please do subscribe to the channel. We've been growing a lot this season, but I really do need the support of you guys. 50% of our viewers, unfortunately, do not subscribe to the content. I know we've had a lot of new viewers lately who've been watching the content, particularly the cheat sheet series. If you've enjoyed the content so far, do feel free to give that a go ahead. So thank you guys so much for watching. Quickly going forwards towards my team here. In terms of the goalkeepers, unfortunately, because we don't expect clean sheets for any of our keepers, I also don't think it would make sense, for example, to suddenly just pick the goalkeeper who I think is going to do the worst. So I'll still take my chances for the goalkeeper and I'll back the clean sheet odds. The clean sheet odds do favor Brentford the most. Now, we know Brentford have been a little bit fraudulent when it comes to clean sheets and conceding goals this season, but I'll take my chances and I'll go with Flecken here as my goalkeeper. And as my replacement goalkeeper, I'll be going with Emi Martinez. So the option here, of course, is to go for highest clean sheet odds and to back it up with a player that I don't think will necessarily conflate with the rest of my team, because one of the interesting things about this week is we kind of want to maximize on our triple ups, right? So with Brentford, unless let's say we get news that Mbumo is going to start, it's very unlikely, for example, that I would be interested in a Brentford triple up at this moment in time. So it makes sense for me to triple up in Brentford with the goalkeeper. And so in terms of defense this week, I think we have a very routine defense. We also have seen Reguilon back in training, and so Reguilon will join the team. When you compare him to Rorslev or even Lewis Potter, I think Reguilon, of course, is the most interesting pick of all the Brentford fullback potential options. So for me, I like him as a great option. Once again, you're sort of doubling up the Brentford defense here, but once again, this is the best clean sheet odds of the week, and he is a very attacking player. So when I go for any defender, of course, I'm expecting them to concede, to be honest, but to also know that the defenders that I'm going for have really good clean sheet odds. And that's it, really. So with Reguilon here, I'm also going with Porro and Doughty. Part of the reason why we're going for Porro is because to triple up with Spurs, unless we have absolute confidence that a player like Johnson or Richarlison is going to play 80, 90 minutes of football, you're not going to get any guarantees outside of Kulusevski, in my opinion. And so because I don't really rate Kulusevski's underlying stats, and I ultimately think that Spurs still have a small chance of getting let's say, a return from a clean sheet, and Porro, of course, is a good player with great underlying stats himself, and so you could arguably treat him as an attacker. I think it makes sense here to go with someone like Porro this game week here and go with Doughty as well, another set-piece threat, and I don't really think I need to explain Doughty. You just saw peak Doughty where he concedes 4 goals to Bournemouth and still returns with 3 points. And we're not expecting much here. We're expecting something little, hopefully not to concede 4 goals from Doughty here, but an occasion, of course, where he would do well. And part of the sort of strategy behind this is that I'm kind of hedging towards, let's say, or against Doughty by going for some attackers from this Nottingham Forest team. In the midfield for this week, we are going for 3 standard players that I think will be locked. And I think that 4th spot is very interesting. That 5th spot potentially could be even more interesting depending on whether you go with the 3-5-2 or 3-4-3. So I'm going with the 3-4-3 on this default setup here, assuming that Watkins is fit. And so the 4 midfielders that I'm actually going with is actually going to be Son, Maddison, and Bowen, that I think are absolutely locked. And then the question, of course, is whether you go for, let's say, Kurush, Paqueta, or maybe an Elanga here as well, or a Gibbs-White. I'm going with Gibbs-White because I still think that he's the penalty taker for this Nottingham Forest team. Part of that, of course, is that this Nottingham Forest team is facing arguably the weakest defensive opposition of this week. This Luton team have now firmly eclipsed the sort of 1st spot in the league in terms of expected goals conceded, so therefore confirming that they're the worst defense in the league. And I still think it's worth targeting them. And that's not to say that Luton are a bad team. It's just that actually when you compare them to some of the other relegation rivals, that actually they're a much more competent attack than a Burnley and a Sheffield United. So it actually makes a lot of sense to target against the Luton defense here, even though I actually own a player within the Luton defense in Doughty who I'm just treating as an attacker. So Gibbs-White is the option that I'm going for here. And then in the forward position, because this is a 3-4-3 draft, I'll just go through that before I go through my bench. So in the forward position, I'll actually be going with Tony, Watkins, and Chris Wood. So once again, targeting Luton. And I think the alternative option that's very popular is Carlton Morris. And I can understand why people are going for Carlton Morris, because with Chris Wood, you have the question mark of whether he starts versus Awani. I still think that Chris Wood has been fit. He's been ready to play. He played 90 minutes last week. He's had a full week of rest and no midweek fixture. So I think Chris Wood is very likely to play 90 minutes again. We've also seen that apparently Taiwo hasn't been pictured in training, but it's very likely that he'll be fit and to be part of the bench for this fixture. But another thing that I think about too is when you're facing a team like Luton and let's say you have a lead versus Luton, for example, the game is within a drawn state, I think it's very likely that Chris Wood is unlikely to be taken off. There's a good punt here, in my opinion, that I don't think Chris Wood is going to be some sort of 65-minute substitution, or that Taiwo is going to come in as a like-for-like substitution. What we very often see with against a team like Luton is that, particularly with the sort of physicalness of the team and the way you play through them, is obviously just by sort of overloading attackers as well and sort of preying on the fact that they overgas themselves, and that there are opportunities, of course, where, for example, let's say if you look at the Bournemouth game as context, you have someone like Enes Ünal coming on, you give up a little bit of the midfield dominance and you actually go purely for the counter to Luton's counter, really. And so that's an interesting thing that I think will happen, and I think Chris Wood should be guaranteed minutes. Now, some people might disagree, and they might actually want to go for Carlton Morris, and I think that's totally fine. If you go for Carlton Morris, this is basically the 11 for 11 default free hit, and that's perfectly fine. It's a very strong free hit, but I like my chances here with Wood. And on the bench, I think what's interesting is that your fifth midfielder rather is potentially someone who could replace Watkins, because let's say Watkins is rested for this West Ham game, it's very likely you'll just be able to call upon the next player up, and that player can be either Elanga, Kudus, Paqueta. It could also be another player as well. There are other midfielders like Bailey, for example, who would definitely stand a chance, even Douglas Luiz, who has done really well lately too, and even Diaby potentially, because let's say if you think that someone like Watkins isn't going to play, that definitely guarantees more Diaby minutes, even though we expect for Duran to be the like-for-like replacement of Watkins. We've seen, for example, in the game versus Ajax that was arguably must-win, that Diaby can play, he can start, and he can do well for this Aston Villa team. So that's something that's also within my consideration. I still think, though, because, for example, a lot of these players are with away fixtures, and the easiest fixture still to target is actually this Nottingham Forest one versus Luton, I will be going for Elanga here as my sort of immediate replacement on the bench. I like Paqueta a lot too, because I think that one thing that's nice about Paqueta is with Ward-Prowse potentially sort of out of the peripheries of that sort of starting West Ham team, you could very well see West Ham start unchanged. And what that would mean, of course, is that Paqueta's nailed as a penalty taker for this West Ham team. So I think he's a very good option as well. With Kudus, you're just purely looking at, amazing open play threat, very much like Elanga, but arguably a slightly tougher opposition. So that's something that sort of, goes between my consideration of an Elanga as well. So Elanga will be sort of my first bench option. I'll be locking him in there. And then the other two picks are just very random. I think you can go for example, Nico Williams if you haven't tripled up on Nottingham Forest like me. But in this situation, because I'm already tripled up, I'm actually going with Cash as my first option on defense as a replacement substitute. And then my last one is going to be Assignon from Burnley. And that's really just a back of the bench type pick, nothing special about it. Hoping, of course, that Reguilon plays. If not, we get Cash, who could be an interesting pick just because attacking fullback, probably going to lock down his position within the team. Not too concerned about his minutes right now, just for the purposes of free at 29. A decent little position to actually jump into the Cash business right here. So that's going to be my bench. Now, going back to captaincy, I think Son for me is the default captaincy option. He has the best goal scoring odds, even higher goal scoring odds than Tony, and Tony will be vice captain as a result of the goal scoring odds being very high. If you look at, for example, the teams to target this week from an offensive point of view, it is Burnley, it is Luton, but of course we do expect, for example, based on Nottingham Forest being such a weak offensive team themselves, that the ceiling isn't necessarily that high, arguably, or it's also spread between multiple players. Whereas, of course, we do expect Tony to have a slightly higher goal share, even though actually Wisa has been the player who has been taking a lot of the plaudits lately by scoring most of the goals for this Brentford team. And Tony, of course, his underlying stats have been poor. But another thing I'd like to mention too is just the quality of games being tougher for Brentford. Always make it a little bit tougher for, let's say, the central threat to benefit within a game. Whereas obviously when you have such an easy fixture on paper, someone like Tony is much more likely to be more involved, as opposed to a game like Arsenal where he's completely shut out, which is basically the case of Arsenal this season being such a strong defense. So I don't think that Arsenal game really showed the full extent of Tony. We have the intangibles here with the penalties as well. We could wait for Mbumo news that could change my draft. I'll wait for the deadline, of course, to confirm any crazy sort of last minute starting news. But on the assumption that Elanga starts, that Gibbs White starts, that Wood starts, I will be going for all these sorts of players on my bench and within my starting team. As I said, I think a really good replacement option if I'm not sure about any of these players is simply going for Paqueta. Now, if I'm also not sure about Wood, I would also say considering, let's say, to go for Muniz or David Dacho Fofana would make a lot of sense. Potentially even going for Wisa would make sense too, but I'm not really going to go any further than that. I think right now I have some confidence that Chris Wood will start, and it is the fixture to target for me, so I will be going with Chris Wood within this draft. A little bit more of a differential here, and I think going for Watkins makes sense because you're never going to triple up on Aston Villa anyways, and you have some really, really capable midfielders to call upon if it suddenly becomes a 3-5-2. So not too worried about that either. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Appreciate you guys so much, and hope you guys have some lovely green arrows ahead. Take care and goodbye.